The day Murak Darkwolf walked into Harrow's Crossing with a chain around her wrist and a soldier's boot print bruised into her jaw, Eli Weston was the only man in the crowded market square who did not reach for a weapon. The autumn trading fair had drawn half the borderland population into Harrow's Crossing that Thursday morning. Wagon beds overflowed with dried corn and bundled furs. Livestock complained in their rope pens near the old well. Children chased chickens between the stalls, while their mothers haggled over bolts of rough-woven cloth and jars of rendered lard. The whole town smelled of wood smoke, horse sweat, and the sharp bite of coming winter, the kind of cold that creeps in off the northern ridges and never quite lets go until March. Eli had come for iron nails and seed grain. He had a homestead 3 miles east of town, a good stretch of cleared land along Redthorn Creek, and a list of winter preparations that grew longer every time he looked at it. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered from years of hard farm work, with dark hair that needed cutting and honest brown eyes that had a habit of seeing more than most men bothered to look for. He was not a complicated man, but he was a careful one, and what he saw when the commotion started near the south gate made his jaw go tight and his fists go still at his sides. 2 border soldiers from the warden's garrison were dragging a woman through the gate on a chain, not guiding, not escorting, dragging. The chain was fastened to an iron collar around her neck, and she was stumbling to keep up with their pace, her knees hitting the dirt twice before they reached the center of the square. The crowd parted and then closed around her like water, people pressing forward to gawk. She was an orc woman, that much was plain. She stood nearly 6 feet tall even in her stumbled posture, with the broad, strong frame of her kind, gray-green skin the color of old sage after rain, and the slightly pronounced lower jaw with its 2 small, neat tusks that barely rose above her upper lip, more elegant than threatening, though Eli doubted the crowd was reading them that way. Her hair was black as crow feathers, thick and tangled from what looked like days of hard travel, pulled back in a rough knot that was half undone. Her eyes, when they rose briefly from the ground, were a deep amber, nearly copper, with a wariness in them that went so far down it looked like a wound. Her outfit was what she had been captured in, a close-fitted leather bodice, darkened from travel and sweat, laced up the front with rawhide cord and fitted snugly to her strong torso, worn over a deep rust-colored blouse with a low collar, the sleeves pushed up past her elbows. Below that she wore snug, frontier-style riding trousers of dark canvas, tucked into knee-high boots that had seen hard miles. Even in this state, bruised, chained, dragged through the mud of Harrow's Crossing's main square, there was something striking about her, not despite her stature or her orcish features but including them. She was in some raw and undeniable way a genuinely beautiful woman, and the world had not managed to make her look small, no matter how hard it was currently trying. The taller of the 2 soldiers, a red-faced man named Corporal Daves, whom Eli recognized from the garrison road patrols, yanked the chain and barked at her to kneel. She went to her knees, not because she wanted to, because the chain snapped her down. The crowd murmured its approval. Someone in the back made a sound Eli refused to identify as laughter. "This one was caught 3 miles north of the Graywash Ford," Corporal Daves announced, his voice carrying across the square with the practiced bellow of a man who liked being heard. "Traveling alone, no clan papers, no warden's pass. Under the Harrow Accord, she's considered an unaffiliated combatant and subject to bond labor until the spring tribunal." Bond labor. Eli had heard the phrase dressed up in legal language before. It meant someone was going to buy the right to work her into the ground for a season, and the warden's garrison would pocket the fee and call it civil order. He had a list. He had nails to buy and grain to load. He had 3 miles of creek trail to get home before the afternoon light died. He stood completely still for the span of 4 long breaths, watching the crowd press forward, watching the soldier hold the chain taut while the woman on her knees kept her eyes fixed on the dirt of the square. Her fists were pressed against her thighs. She was not shaking. Whatever she was feeling, She had locked it somewhere too deep to show. Eli walked forward. People moved aside partly because of his size and partly because of the look on his face, which was the particular look of a man who has made a decision and is not open to further input on the matter. He pushed through to the front and stopped in front of Murak Darkwolf, though he did not know her name yet, and looked down at her on her knees in the dirt. Then he looked at Corporal Daves. "What's the bond rate?" he said. Daves blinked, clearly having expected protest rather than commerce. "2 silver marks for the season, non-negotiable." "I'll pay it." Eli reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced his coin purse. He counted out 2 marks and held them out. "And I want the collar off." "Collar stays on. Warden's requirement for unaffiliated." "The collar comes off," Eli said, "or you put your 2 marks back in your pocket and explain to your warden why you've got a chained woman sitting in his market square with no buyer and a crowd that's going to be drunk by nightfall." There was a long pause. Daves looked at the coin, then at Eli, then at the crowd, which had gone very quiet and very interested. He took the money. He unlocked the collar. The woman on her knees in the dirt reached up slowly and touched her own throat, pressing her fingers against the reddened skin where the iron had bitten. Eli crouched down in front of her, putting himself at her level in the middle of the square with every person in Harrow's Crossing watching. He looked her in the eye. "You don't have to kneel here," he told her quietly. She looked at him. Really looked at him the way a person looks when they are trying to find the trick, the catch, the place where the kindness turns into something that costs more than the cruelty did. She found nothing. His eyes were simply steady. She wept into her hands. It was not a soft, ladylike weeping. It was the kind that comes up from the gut after days of holding everything locked down, the kind that shakes the shoulders and makes no sound at first because the sound is too big to come out all at once. She pressed both hands over her face and her whole body shook, and Eli did not pull away or look around at the crowd or do anything except stay crouched where he was, steady and close, until the first wave passed. Then he straightened, offered her his hand, and helped her to her feet. He picked up the iron collar from the dirt, walked to the edge of the square where the old well stood, and dropped it in. The splash it made was deeply satisfying. She was standing on her own when he turned back, her hands hanging at her sides, her copper eyes dry now and watchful. She looked like a woman who was trying to decide if this was a different kind of trap. "I'm Eli Weston," he said. "I've got a homestead east of here along Redthorn Creek. I could use help getting the winter harvest in and the barn reinforced before the cold settles. It's real work. I'll pay you in board and wages, same as I would anyone." He paused. "You're not obligated to come. You can walk out those gates right now and I won't say a word." A long moment passed. The crowd was still watching, though it had begun to lose the sharp, predatory edge it had carried earlier. Murak Darkwolf looked at the gate behind her, then back at Eli. Her voice, when it came, was lower than he expected, with a slight roughness to it like gravel at the bottom of a clear stream. "How do I know you're not the same as them?" she said. "You don't," he said honestly. "Not yet." She studied him for another moment. Then she nodded, barely perceptibly, and he walked to the grain merchant's stall and finished his list. She walked beside him, not behind him, beside him. The ride back to the homestead was quiet. Eli had a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 dun-colored draft horses named Cork and Barrel, and the iron nails clinked softly in their sack against the grain bags with every rut in the trail. Murak sat on the bench beside him, not pressed against the outer edge, not huddled away, just sitting in the straightforward way of someone who has decided to be here and is still deciding what here is going to mean. The forest closed around the trail east of town, pine and birch mixed together with the birch going gold and yellow in the dying season, and the light came through in long slanted beams that moved across the horses' backs as they plodded along. Murak watched the trees. Her hands were folded in her lap. The bruise on her jaw was deepening toward purple. "Does it need tending?" Eli said without looking over. She touched the bruise unconsciously. "It will heal. I've got comfrey salve at the house. It helps with the color and the ache." She did not answer right away, then quietly, "My name is Murak Darkwolf." Murak, he repeated, trying the weight of it. That's a strong name. It was my mother's. A pause. She is gone. I'm sorry. Another silence. The horses pulled steadily. A crow called from somewhere in the birch canopy and swept overhead in a wide, dark arc. What clan were you traveling from? He asked, keeping his voice easy like he was asking about weather. The Darkwolf clan is scattered now, she said. The warden's forces pushed north of the Greywash 3 years ago. Most of my people crossed into the deep range. She stopped. I was trying to find what remained. Did you? She looked at her hands. I found graves. He didn't push further. He said nothing at all, which Murak would think later was exactly the right thing. The homestead came into view when the trail curved along the creek bank, a solid log house with a fieldstone chimney, a barn in decent repair with a new-looking roof on the west side, a kitchen garden gone to autumn stubble, split-rail fencing running along the creek, and a woodpile beside the house that was, she noted with a practical eye, not nearly large enough for a hard winter. This is yours, she said. Mine and the bank's, he said dryly, pulling the horses to a stop in the yard. But yes. He climbed down and began unhitching cork and barrel while she stood in the yard and looked at the place. It was not large. It was not grand. But it had been built with care, the logs fitted tight, the foundation level, the garden arranged sensibly around the morning sun line. It was the homestead of someone who thought about what they were doing. You live here alone, she said. Going on 4 years, he led the horses toward the barn. My father left me the land. He died 2 winters ago. My mother was already gone by then. She followed him into the barn, which was warm with animal heat from the 2 horses and a pair of milk cows in the far stalls. She helped him hang the tack without being asked, and he noted with approval that she handled the gear properly, knowing where things went, which meant she had spent time around animals. You know barns, he said. We had horses in the clan, she said simply. He showed her the spare room without ceremony. It was a small space off the main room of the log house, containing a rope bed with a cornhusk mattress, a wool blanket, a wooden chest, and a small window that looked east toward the creek. He put the comfrey salve on the window ledge without saying anything about it. She understood. She slept 10 hours that first night, the deep collapsed sleep of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and was cautiously, incrementally, letting themselves not be afraid. In the morning, she found him at the cook fair making oat porridge and putting up a coffee pot that smelled like the most important thing in the world. He handed her a bowl without preamble and pointed at the jar of honey on the table. She put 3 generous spoons of honey in the porridge and ate standing up, looking out the window at the frozen fog over the creek. The woodpile isn't enough, she said. I know. You'll need at least double what you have before the deep cold. I know that too. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. I've been trying to get the east field ditch cleared before the ground freezes and it got ahead of me. I can split wood, she said. I figured you might say that. So that was how it began. Not with speeches or promises or treaties, but with an oat porridge and a coffee and a conversation about firewood that was really a conversation about survival, which was, in its own practical way, a conversation about trust. The days fell into rhythm quickly, the way days on a working homestead always do when there is a clear and pressing list of things that must be accomplished before winter makes them impossible. Murak split wood in the mornings with a long-handled axe, and she was extraordinarily good at it, powerful and economical, with a clean stroke that split even the knotted rounds on the first blow. Eli hauled and stacked, and they worked in a comfortable parallel silence that neither of them rushed to fill with words. The east ditch got cleared by the end of the first week. The grain went into the root cellar properly sorted and sealed in oilcloth. The barn got new chinking along the north wall, where the wind had been finding gaps. The woodpile grew until it stood chest-high along the full length of the house's east wall, and Eli looked at it one late afternoon when the light was turning red and felt the particular satisfaction of a winter that has been properly prepared for. Murak stood beside him looking at it too. There was a flush in her gray-green cheeks from the cold and the work, and sawdust in her black hair, and she was breathing in the sharp, satisfied way of someone who has put their body to good, honest use. She looked at the woodpile with something approaching contentment. "That'll do," she said. "That'll do," he agreed. The comfrey salve had done its work on the bruise within 10 days. The color faded out and the ache went with it, and she had said nothing about it, but he had seen her touch her jaw less and less as the days passed. That seemed like a good thing. The first real test came at the end of the second week, when Eli drove into Harrow's Crossing for the weekly supply run and brought Murak along because the grain merchant had shorted him on the last order, and he needed someone to hold the horses while he argued the account. He knew what might happen in town, and he did not pretend otherwise. It happened at the Merchant's Row, as he'd expected. 2 men from the garrison side of town, not soldiers, just men who had absorbed the garrison's attitudes like water through limestone, blocked the path in front of his wagon with their own cart placed sideways. The taller one, a tanner named Groft who had bad teeth and worse opinions, pointed at Murak on the bench. "Heard you took in a stray, Weston," Groft said, with the pleased drawl of a man delivering an insult he'd been rehearsing. "Town council's got something to say about orcs residing inside the market circuit." Eli set the hand brake on the wagon and climbed down at a deliberate pace. He stood in the road between his wagon and Groft's cart, in the full public view of the market row, and he looked at Groft with the same clear, uncomplicated brown eyes he had looked at Corporal Dave's with 2 weeks ago in the square. "She's employed labor on a registered homestead," Eli said. "Warden's bond labor rules cover that. You want to argue the warden's own charter with me, I'll wait," Groft sputtered. "Or," Eli continued, "you can move your cart and I can go buy my flour and you can go back to not being my business." There was a moment, one of those hanging moments where everything could go in several directions, and then Groft moved his cart, because the market row was full of people watching, and there was nothing more deflating to a bully than an audience that isn't entertained by him. Murak said nothing until they were loading the flour sacks, and Eli was trying very hard to not look like he was checking her expression. "That happens a lot here," she said. "Less than it used to," he said. "More than it should." She was quiet for a moment, hands wrapped around a 50-pound flour sack that she lifted as if it weighed nothing. "You did not have to do that. I was just clarifying the charter." He heaved his own sack into the wagon bed. "The warden's rules actually do cover what I said, by the way. I'm not just saying things." "I know," she said. "I have read the Harrow Accord." He looked at her. "You've read it." "My mother made sure I could read," she said, without defensiveness, just the plain fact of it. "She said it was a weapon that didn't rust." He thought about that for the rest of the drive home, and somewhere along the birchline trail, with the gold leaves coming down around the horses' heads and the cold creek running alongside, he thought about how much he had been assuming and how carefully he ought to stop doing that. The evenings were becoming a thing of their own. The days were work, but the evenings, when the fire was banked and the supper dishes were done, and the wind came down off the northern ridges and pressed itself against the log walls, those evenings had a different character. Eli had a habit of reading by the fire historical records, farming manuals, a battered almanac he'd read 4 times, anything with words in it. He offered Murak his small shelf of books without ceremony, and she took a slim volume of borderland surveying maps and studied it with the focused intensity of someone looking for something specific. "Were you trying to find something on the maps?" he asked one night from across the fire. She traced a line on the page with one finger. Her hands were large and graceful, he had noticed, with calluses from the axe work sitting neatly on the same spots his own calluses sat. "There is a valley north of the Greywash Ridge," she said. "The Darkwolf clan's old summer ground, before the war pushed north." He leaned over to look where her finger rested on the page. He was closer to her than he usually positioned himself, and he was aware of that, aware of the warmth of her arm near his, the smell of wood smoke in her hair. He looked at the map. "That's Heron's Valley," he said. "I've been up there once. Good land. Running water, good shelter from the ridge. Is it occupied? Not that I saw. It's too far from the garrison roads for most settlers. Too hard to get a wagon in without knowing the passes. I know the passes, she said quietly. He looked at her. In the firelight, her copper eyes were very warm, and she was looking at the map with a kind of aching longing that was the clearest emotion he had seen from her yet. Do you want to go back there? He said. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind pressed against the logs. One of the milk cows shifted in the barn with a low, comfortable sound that carried across the yard. I do not know yet what I want, she said carefully. I am still learning what is possible. That sentence stayed with him for a long time. 3 weeks into the arrangement, the first snow came. It came quietly, as the first snows in the borderlands often do, no wind. Just a slow and serious falling of white that started before dawn and was still going when Eli came out to do the morning milking. By midday it had laid a solid foot across the yard and was still coming down, steady and unhurried, turning the world into a simplified thing of black trees and white ground and gray sky. Murak was already in the barn when he got there, had already milked both cows and was working a burr out of Cork's mane with patient fingers. The horse stood with his lower lip hanging in that particular draft horse expression of absolute contentment. You didn't have to start without me, he said. You looked like you were sleeping when I came through the main room, she said. You were making a noise like a sawmill. He stared at her. She kept working Cork's mane with complete composure, but the very corner of her mouth moved. It was the first thing that had approximated humor that he had seen from her, and it landed in him like a struck match. I do not snore, he said. You absolutely snore, she said. The corner of her mouth moved again. He laughed. It came out before he could evaluate it. A genuine, chest-deep laugh that filled the warm barn, and Cork flicked an ear. And Murak finally allowed the corner of her mouth to become a full, small smile, which transformed her face in a way that made him feel as if something in his chest had quietly shifted several inches to the left. She had a beautiful smile. He filed that information away and pretended he hadn't. The snowfall kept them on the homestead for 3 days, and they ate stew from the root cellar vegetables and played a card game that Eli knew 3 variants of and taught her all 3, and she turned out to be ruthlessly good at cards, which she attributed without embarrassment to her mother having taught her that as well. Eli began to think Murak's mother had been a remarkable woman. Murak confirmed this without being asked. She was the best warrior in the Darkwolf clan, she said one evening, dealing cards with practiced efficiency. She could read. She spoke 3 languages. She made the best root bread I have ever tasted before or since. Which 3 languages? Orcish, Common Tongue, and Old Warden script. She paused. She said knowing the enemy's paperwork was worth more than knowing their battle formations. She sounds formidable. She was, the briefest tightening around her eyes. She died holding a pass so that the rest of the clan could cross the greywash. The soldiers were 3-1 against her. Another pause, completely level. She held the pass. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He held it with her in the silence, the way he had learned to do, and she laid down 3 cards that won the hand without breaking stride, and that was that. The snow melted by the 4th day and the work resumed, and life on the homestead continued in its steady, honest rhythm, but something had shifted in those 3 snowbound days. Something had been added to the silence between them, a specific quality of warmth that was different from the neutral comfort of 2 people simply coexisting. He noticed it in small ways. She walked slightly closer to him when they worked the same row of tasks. He found himself timing his fireside reading, so it coincided with her evenings in the main room rather than his usual early retreat. When she laughed, still rarely, still quietly, he felt it as a specific physical thing. He was careful with himself about this. He was aware of the power arrangement embedded in the bond labor situation, the way it could warp something true into something pressured even without intending to. He was careful not to press, not to claim any proximity she hadn't freely offered, not to let his own growing feelings become weight that she had to manage. She noticed his carefulness. She noticed it the way she noticed everything on the homestead, with practical intelligence and a memory that cataloged accurately. And slowly, over the weeks following the first snow, she began making her own small movements toward him. She brought him coffee before he asked in the mornings. She sat closer at the fireside, near enough that their shoulders occasionally touched when both of them were bent over something on the table. She began telling him things about herself without waiting for him to ask small things, fragments of her life before Harrow's Crossing, a horse she had once loved named Grashed, a sister who had crossed the deep range and was presumably still alive somewhere east of the mountains, the particular way the summer ground in Heron's Valley had smelled in June, like pine resin and wild thyme, and something she had no word for that was simply home. One evening in early December, the two of them were by the fire and Eli was trying to resole a boot and making a mess of the stitching, and Murak reached over and took the boot and the awl and the thread from him without ceremony and did it herself, with the neat, exact stitches of someone who had been making and mending her own gear since childhood. He watched her work, firelight moving across her face, her black hair loose around her shoulders because she had unpinned it to let it dry after washing, and he was struck, not for the first time but more strongly than before, by how completely she had come to feel like a part of this place, of this house, of this particular evening's warmth. "You are staring," she said without looking up from the boot. "I'm watching you work," he said, which was true. "Is there a difference?" "Technically, yes." He paused. "How did you know you were good at that? At boot repair? At all of it? The barn work, the field work, the reading, the cards. You are good at everything you turn your hands to." She was quiet for a moment, pushing the needle through with careful precision. "My mother believed that being orc in a world that despises you means you must do everything twice as well as anyone else, or they will use your failures as a reason to despise you more." She pulled the thread taut. "I did not always agree with that. Sometimes I just wanted to be ordinary good at things, not extraordinarily good at things out of necessity." She paused, "But the skill remains, whatever the reason." He was quiet for a moment, then, "For what it's worth, I think you should get to be good at things just because you are good at them." She looked up at him then directly, the firelight catching in her copper eyes. The look lasted long enough to be something more than a glance, long enough to make him very still. "Yes," she said softly. "I am beginning to think so too." She handed him back the boot. Their fingers touched in the exchange, and neither of them pulled away at once, and then the fire popped and the moment moved on the way moments do, but it left a warmth behind it that had nothing to do with the hearth. December deepened into the serious cold of the borderland winter. The creek froze from the banks inward each night and thawed slightly each midday. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows in the deep hours before dawn and melted when the morning fire caught. The horses grew thick winter coats, and the milk cows gave less each week, as they always did in the cold months, and the homestead pulled in around its own warmth like a cupped hand. The bond labor agreement Eli had technically purchased ran to the spring tribunal, but it existed on paper only. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it, and the practical reality of life on the homestead bore no relationship to anything involving papers or garrison authorities. She worked because the work needed doing, and she was someone who felt better when she was useful. He paid her a fair wage in coin every week, the same wage he would have paid any hired hand, and she put the coins in the wooden chest in her room without comment. In the middle of December, trouble came down from the northern road in the form of 3 men on horseback who arrived at the homestead gate in the early afternoon, dismounted without being invited, and announced that they were representing the local landowners' council and had come to formally advise Eli Weston that his arrangement with an unregistered orc laborer was under review. Eli came out of the barn with a pitchfork in his hand, not threateningly, just because that was what he'd been working with, and stood in the frozen yard in front of his gate and looked at them. Murak had been splitting the late afternoon kindling, and she stopped when the men rode up, standing at the woodblock with the axe in her hands, 20 feet from Eli's left shoulder, and she did not move or lower the axe. The man leading the group, a heavy-set landowner named Burl who ran 400 acres of grain land west of town, laid out his case with the practiced smoothness of a man who had done this kind of thing before. The landowner's council, he said, had concerns about property values, about precedent, about the Harrow Accord's intentions regarding orc residency in the market circuit. He was not threatening. He was simply advising. Eli listened to all of it. He listened with the patient attention he gave to everything, and when Burl was finished, he leaned the pitchfork against the fence rail and put both hands in his coat pockets and said, "I appreciate you riding out. My answer is no." Burl blinked. "No to which part?" "To all of it. I run my homestead within the law. I have checked the law carefully." He paused. "If the council wants to challenge the warden's bond labor charter or the common employment provisions of the Harrow Accord, they're welcome to do that in front of a magistrate. I'll be happy to present my documentation there." Burl leaned forward on his horse. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Weston." "You rode onto my property without invitation," Eli said mildly. "I think you've already set the difficulty level." The three men exchanged a look. Then Burl sat back and said something under his breath that Eli chose not to respond to, and they rode out through the gate. Eli watched them go up the road until they were out of sight. He turned around. Murak was standing exactly where she had been, the axe still in her hands, her copper eyes on him. Something in her expression was very careful and very full at the same time, like a cup that is trying not to spill. "That will not be the last visit," she said. "I expect not." He walked back toward the barn. "But the answer won't change." She stood for a moment. Then she set the axe down against the woodblock and she walked after him, and she grabbed his arm, not roughly but firmly, turning him around, and she looked at him directly. "Why?" she said. The word was plain and unadorned. She meant all of it: the market square, the collar in the well, the tanner's cart, the garrison men, Burl and the council, all of it. "Why?" He looked at her. The cold was biting, and the sky was going dark early the way December skies do, and her breath made small clouds in the freezing air, and her copper eyes were as serious as anything he had ever seen. "Because it's right," he said. "And then because that was true but not quite complete, and because you deserve to be here, on this homestead or any other place you choose, without a chain and without a man on a horse telling you otherwise." She did not weep this time. She had used those tears in the square weeks ago, and what was in her now was a different thing, too large for crying, too warm and too frightening to be named yet. She held his gaze for a long, steady moment, and then she nodded once slowly and let go of his arm. But she stood close to him for the rest of the evening, closer than the work required, and when their hands met passing a bowl at supper, she didn't pull away immediately, and he didn't either. Christmas came and went with no particular ceremony. Eli was not a religious man in the formal sense, though he observed the midwinter week with a beeswax candle in the window and a slightly better supper than usual, which for the holiday in question meant venison stew from the deer he had gotten in November, with dried apple tart for after. He had traded one of his extra blankets at the market for a small tin of real ground spice to put in the tart, which was an extravagance he had been slightly embarrassed about and had not mentioned. Murak tasted the tart with the spice and looked across the table at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, which was the particular expression she wore when something had moved her and she was trying to decide whether to acknowledge it. "The spice is good," she said. "I traded for it." "I know," she said. "I noticed the blanket was gone." He said nothing. She looked at her plate. "Thank you, Eli," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without his surname. He noted this very specifically. The new year came in with a 3-day blizzard that shook the log house on its foundations and buried the barn door to the halfway point, and they spent 3 days shoveling and reshoveling paths and keeping the livestock warm and fed. On the second night of the storm, the kitchen fire and the hearth fire combined were not quite enough, and they ended up on opposite sides of the hearth with blankets, and the fire stoked as high as it would safely go and the wind shrieking in the chimney. And somewhere in the small hours, they had both fallen asleep on the floor in front of the hearth, not quite touching but close. And Eli woke in the gray early morning to find that they were touching, her shoulder against his arm. Her head tilted slightly his direction, though still upright, both of them still wrapped in their own blankets. He did not move. He watched the fire die down to coals and the light change from black to gray outside the window, and he was aware, with a specific and careful clarity, that this was one of the most comfortable things he had ever felt in his life. She woke an hour later, became aware of the proximity, and did not immediately pull away. She sat in it for a moment in the quiet and the warmth, and then she looked at him and he was already looking at her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "The storm is still going," she said eventually. "Yes, we should check the barn. In a minute." Another silence, entirely companionable. "Eli," she said quietly. "Yes." She looked at the fire, then back at him. "I am glad you were in the square that day." "So am I," he said. Something settled between them after that, the way a foundation settles, not dramatically, just imperceptibly firming into permanence. In February, the cold began to break in small increments. The creek ran under its ice again, audible on cold mornings, a murmuring promise of spring. Murak began talking more openly about the summer ground in Heron's Valley, about what it would take to get there in early spring, about whether there was any point in trying to find her sister. Eli listened. He had been listening for 4 months now, and he was good at it. He had also been thinking, and what he had been thinking had taken a shape that scared him a little, because it was a large shape and an honest one, and he wasn't fully certain what she would make of it. One evening in late February, with the first mud of the thaw soft in the yard and the first returning birds making noise in the birch stand along the creek, he was sitting at the kitchen table going through his account books when Murak came in from the barn and put a hand on the back of the chair across from him and said, "May I say something?" "Always," he said. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table, the axe-calloused hands that he knew as well as his own by now, and she looked at him with the full direct clarity she brought to everything. "I have been thinking about leaving," she said. He felt the sentence land in him. He kept his face even though it cost him something. "Heron's Valley, perhaps, or east to find my sister. I do not know the shape of it yet." A pause. "The bond labor paper expires at the spring tribunal. You know I was never truly bound by it, not in the way you ran this house. But the expiration marks a kind of turning point." She looked at the table. "I wanted to tell you I was thinking about it, not just to leave without saying." He was quiet for a moment. He closed the account book. He had been honest with himself about this for weeks now, and he was going to be honest out loud because dishonesty in this particular matter would be a kind of theft. "If you go," he said carefully, "that's your right, and I'll help you provision for it. I'll write you a letter of character for any warden post you pass through." He paused. "But I want you to know something first, and then whatever you decide it knowing." She was very still. "I am in love with you," he said, not as a declaration of claim or a pressure applied. Just as a fact being laid on the table like the account book, something that existed and had a right to be acknowledged. "I have been for a while, and I didn't say it because the balance of things here didn't seem right to say it in. You were in a situation and I was the person who had purchased you out of it, and I was not going to use that." He met her eyes. "But the paper expires in a month, and after that there's no arrangement between us except whatever we choose. So I wanted you to know the thing I know, and then you can choose freely." The fire in the hearth ticked. The creek ran under its last ice outside. Murak looked at him for a long time. Her expression was not the careful, contained look she wore when she was managing something difficult. It was the open look, the one she had only started showing in the last month or two, the one that had her full self in it. "You ridiculous man," she said softly. He blinked. "I have been waiting," she said, "for 2 months for you to say something like that." I did not know how to say it first because I was not certain. I am still not entirely certain whether what I feel is the right kind of love or the kind that is made by gratitude and dependency and being frightened. She paused. But when I think about leaving, and I think about leaving without you, it feels like, she stopped. Try it again. It feels like losing the language I just learned to speak. He was across the table from her, and he moved around it, and she stood. And there was a moment of about 3 feet of space between them where everything that had been building for 4 months sat suspended in the air. And then she stepped into it, and he stepped into it, and his arms went around her and hers went around him. And she pressed her face against the side of his neck, and he pressed his cheek against her black hair. And they stood that way in the kitchen for a long, long time. When she pulled back, it was to look at him, and he looked at her, and he brought one hand up to cup her face gently along the jaw where the bruise had been and was now long healed. She turned her cheek into his hand like a thing that had been waiting to do that exact movement. And he kissed her, carefully and with his whole heart, and she kissed him back with the same. It was not a passionate, overwhelming kiss, though there was heat in it. It was a kiss with a foundation in it, like a cornerstone being placed. It was the kind of kiss that is a beginning rather than a peak. When they separated, she had her hands at his chest, and her copper eyes were very bright. "The spring tribunal," she said. "The paper expires." "Yes." "After which there is no arrangement between us except what we choose." "Yes." "Then I choose," she said, "to stay." March arrived with the full thaw and the mud season that followed it, which was as unglamorous as it always was, the yard a sea of boot-sucking brown, the wagon getting mired twice on the supply road, the horses needing their hooves picked daily from the packed mud. But the creek was running bright and loud, and the birch stand was showing the first pale green haze of new leaves, and the kitchen garden needed to be turned over, and there was a great deal of seed to be planted, and all of it felt different now, the work and the spring and the homestead and the days. Everything felt different because it was shared differently. Not just as employer and employed, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people who had looked at each other honestly and chosen. There was a new ease between them, and a new electricity both at once. They worked side by side in the garden one warm March afternoon, Eli turning the black earth with a long-handled fork and Murak breaking the clods with a hoe, working in the loose harmony of people who know each other's pace. She was humming something under her breath, an orcish melody with a minor key run in it that was somehow both melancholy and cheerful, the way some of the best music manages to be both at once. He listened to it, and something in his chest was so full it was almost uncomfortable. "What is that?" he said. "A planting song," she said. "My mother sang it every spring when she put the first seeds in. I do not know if it helps the seeds, but it helps the planting." "Sing it properly," he said. She stopped hoeing and looked at him. "Please," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she sang. Her voice was low and strong and had a resonant quality that moved through him like a plucked string. The melody had the wide-open feeling of the borderland spring in it, of thaw and new green, and the specific ache of something returning that you had almost given up on. She sang it all the way through, one verse and then a second, while the crows rode the updrafts above the birch stand, and the creek ran its loud, bright commentary along the eastern fence line. When she finished, she went back to her hoeing. He stood with the fork in his hands and the turned earth rich and black at his feet and did not say anything at all because there was nothing to add. She glanced at him. "You look like you're going to be foolish about it." "I probably am," he said. "I don't mind," she said softly and kept hoeing. Spring brought company. The first week of April, a wagon came up the eastern trail and stopped at the homestead gate, driven by a woman Eli did not know, a tall orc woman, darker skinned than Murak, with the same crow-black hair and a pair of tusks that were more prominent, her amber eyes scanning the yard with careful intelligence. She had a young man beside her on the bench, human, wiry, with sun-dark skin and a long rifle across his knees, watching the homestead with the measuring look of someone who has learned caution from experience. Murak had been coming out of the barn with a bucket, and she saw the wagon and stopped walking. The woman on the wagon saw her. There was a long, suspended moment. Then both women were moving at the same time, crossing the yard at a full run, and they collided in the middle of the yard with a force that made Eli flinch slightly. Both arms locked around each other, both making sounds in Orcish that he had no language for but needed none. They stood there holding each other while the young man on the wagon looked at Eli, and Eli looked back at him, and they exchanged the universal expression of two people watching something private and large and joyful and not wanting to intrude on it. The woman was Kara, Murak's sister. She had been east of the mountains, as Murak had suspected, and had spent the winter making her way back along the deep range with her traveling companion, a young man named Davin who had grown up on a trading post family near the Eastern Pass, and had, in the course of traveling with Kara, developed feelings for her that she returned with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has had ample time to be sure about something. They stayed 3 days. It was 3 days of meals around the kitchen table, of late nights by the fire with cups of grain whiskey that Eli produced from the back of the root cellar, of conversations that were sometimes between all four of them and sometimes between the two sisters in their own language, while Eli and Davin sat outside with the horses and talked about trail conditions and seed varieties and the other comfortable subjects of frontier life. On the last evening, Kara sat beside Eli on the porch step while Murak and Davin were tending the horses, and the sky was the deep blue-black of an early spring night with a half-moon riding above the birch stand. "My sister does not scare easily," Kara said. "I know," Eli said. "She was scared of you for the first month here, she told me." He looked at that. "I know. She is not scared anymore." Kara looked at the barn door behind which voices were going back and forth in comfortable domestic noise. "She told me what you did in the square with the collar." A pause. "She said she wept. I have not seen my sister weep in 7 years." He said nothing. "You are a good man, Eli Weston," Kara said, with the plain directness of someone giving information rather than a compliment. "Do not let the borderland make you less of one." "I'll try," he said. She slapped him once on the back, hard enough to knock the breath out in what he recognized as an orc expression of affirmation, and went inside. He sat on the step breathing and watching the moon, and when Murak came out of the barn and found him there, she came and sat beside him, tucked herself against his side under his arm, and they sat together watching the spring night turn slowly above the birch trees. "She approves of you," Murak said. "She hit me quite hard." "That means she likes you very much." She pressed her face against the side of his neck. He could feel her smiling. "A mild approval is a handshake. A strong approval is a blow." "I was not aware of this system," he said. "You are aware of it now." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She made a small, contented sound. The moon moved. The creek ran. The spring night held them in its ordinary miracle. Kara and Davin went east again in the morning, carrying a week's worth of food from Eli's stores and directions to a trading post 3 days' ride that Davin had known in his childhood and thought might still be standing. There were plans made, loose, frontier-style plans that accounted for the unpredictability of the world, to meet in Heron's Valley by midsummer if the roads allowed. That plan became the shape of the next season. Through April and May, the homestead work expanded with the spring. New ground was broken along the creek's south bank, a full additional half-acre that Murak argued convincingly would give them a summer vegetable surplus large enough to sell at the Harrow's Crossing market. Eli bought 2 new laying hens and a rooster and built a coop along the barn's east wall. The creek flooded in late April, and they spent 2 days moving things to higher ground and 3 days moving them back, and came out of it exhausted and laughing at the absurdity of it, mud-covered and successful. The town of Harrow's Crossing was not transformed overnight into a place of warmth and welcome for Murak Darkwolf, because towns do not transform overnight. But it changed, because single people within it changed, one at a time, through contact with the particular reality of the woman rather than the abstraction of what they feared. The grain merchant's wife, a sharp-minded woman named Hesse, began greeting Murak by name in late April. The farrier's apprentice, a boy of about 16 who had been terrified of her at their first meeting, became gradually, over several visits, openly fascinated by her, and took to following her around the market asking questions about Orcish ironwork, until she started answering them, patiently and at length, because she knew that a curious teenager was not an enemy in training. The landowner's council did not come back, perhaps because the spring tribunal had come and gone with no legal challenge to Eli's arrangements, perhaps because Burrell had done the math on public opinion and found it less favorable than he'd expected. Whatever the reason, they did not come back. In June, Eli proposed. He had been planning it for 6 weeks and had done it spectacularly badly regardless. He had been thinking about something formal, something with words prepared, possibly at the creek where the morning light came through the birches in a particularly beautiful way. Instead, he had done it over breakfast while they were both eating oat porridge and she was reading the almanac and he was looking at her reading it and thinking about the year that had passed, the chain and the square and the mud and the blizzard and the first snow and the planting song and all of it. And he had opened his mouth to say something ordinary and instead said, "Will you marry me?" She looked up from the almanac. There was honey on the spoon in her hand, halfway to her porridge. "What?" she said. "Marry me," he said. "I'd like us to be married, if you want to be." She looked at him for a long, absolutely inscrutable moment. The honey dripped off the spoon into the porridge bowl. She did not notice. "Eli," she said slowly, "is this the moment you chose to ask me this?" It seems to have been yes, over porridge. The timing was not deliberate. She set the spoon down. She looked at the table, then at him, and her expression moved through several things, none of which he could read precisely, and landed somewhere that was warm and helpless and completely certain. "Yes," she said. "Over the porridge and in spite of the porridge, yes." Laughed, the big helpless chest laugh she had first heard in the barn over Cork's mane, and she was laughing too, and he came around the table and she stood to meet him, and he held her face in both his hands and kissed her properly, warmly, thoroughly, with the honey spoon still lying in her bowl and the morning light coming in the eastern window and the almanac lying open on the table. They planned a simple ceremony at the homestead in late August to give Kara and Davin time to make it back from the east. Eli went into Harrow's Crossing and saw the circuit magistrate, a dry, methodical woman named Judge Caro, who had the rare quality of applying the law without particularly caring about the opinions of the people around her. She performed civil unions under the Harrow Accord. She confirmed, between any 2 adult persons of recognized standing, and Eli's homestead was registered, and Murak's bond period had concluded without incident, so yes, she could see no legal obstruction. Hesse, the grain merchant's wife, who had become something approaching a friend to Murak, in the way that competent and direct women often find each other and become useful to each other, helped Murak find a dress from a merchant woman who was passing through from the western trading routes. The dress was deep green, a fitted linen with a bodice that laced up the front in a way that was structurally similar to the leather bodice she had worn since the day of the square, because she was who she was and she wore fitted things, and it suited her extraordinarily well. She wore her black hair loose down her back, held back from her face with a braided leather cord she had made herself, decorated with 2 small carved bone beads that had been her mother's. Kara and Davin arrived 4 days before the ceremony, trail-dusty and tired, and carrying a clay pot full of a dark, fragrant Orcish preserve that Kara had made somewhere along the eastern range from black plums and spice bark, a traditional Darkwolf clan wedding gift. She pressed it into Murak's hands with a grip that shook slightly and did not say anything, and Murak pressed her forehead to her sister's forehead, and they stood that way for a long moment in the yard of the homestead with the August sun on their backs. The ceremony was held in the yard on a Tuesday morning, which was the magistrate's available day. Judge Caro drove out in her own wagon, read the civil union words from her worn, leather-covered manual with brisk efficiency and genuine dignity, and asked the questions, and received the answers, and wrote the record in her ledger and blotted it and blew on it and said, "You're married," in the same tone she used for everything, which was to say a tone that suggested facts were facts and required no additional decoration. Eli looked at Murak when it was done, his wife. The words settling into him like the foundation of the house had settled firmly and permanently. And she looked back at him with the full open look, the one that had nothing held back in it, and she reached up and put one hand on his cheek, and he leaned into it and they kissed in the August sunshine while Kara made a sound of approval that rattled the windows and Davin applauded, and Hessa, who had ridden out for the occasion, produced a small flask of good brandy that she claimed she had just happened to have on her person. The preserve Kara had brought turned out to be magnificent on fresh bread, which Murak made that afternoon in the kitchen while Kara sat on the counter and they talked and laughed and argued about small things in both languages, and Eli and Davin sat on the porch step with tin mugs and listened to the sound of the house full and alive around them. "You did something unusual," Davin said, not unkindly. "I suppose," Eli said. "Most men in this borderland wouldn't have." "Most men in this borderland are wrong about a great number of things," Eli said. Davin drank his coffee. "She's good people. She's the best person I know," Eli said simply, and meant it with every part of himself. The summer ground in Heron's Valley had been on both their minds since February, and in September, when the harvest was in, and the homestead was set for winter with someone trustworthy in place to watch the stock. A teenager from a neighboring farm who was reliable and grateful for the work. Eli and Murak saddled Cork and Barrel, and loaded a pack mule and rode north together for the first time, up the Pine Ridge, and through the mountain passes that Murak knew by instinct and memory. The ones her mother had known and her mother before that. The valley opened before them on the third afternoon. It was everything she had described, and more a wide bowl of land cupped between two long ridge arms, a clear creek running through the middle, old-growth pine on the slopes, and a stretch of flat valley floor that had been, in the old clan days, the summer grazing ground. The hide tent frames were long gone, rotted or carried off, but the fire rings remained, and the stone windbreaks at the creek crossing, and the flat grinding stone near the old clan gathering place, moss-covered and permanent. Murak got down from her horse and walked to the center of the valley floor, the September grass long and gold around her, and she stood there in the afternoon sun looking at all of it. Eli stayed on his horse and watched her. She walked slowly to the fire rings, one after another, touching them with her hand. She walked to the grinding stone and pressed both palms flat against the worn surface of it. She stood at the creek crossing and looked up at the ridge line. The wind moved through the long grass in slow waves, and she was perfectly still in the middle of it. Then she turned to look at him, across the distance of the valley floor, and even at that distance he could see her face, and he knew what was in it. He got down from Cork and walked to her. He stood beside her and they looked at the valley together. "This is where my people came in summer," she said quietly. "3 generations of Darkwolf clan. This is where my mother was born. This was home." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It could be home again if you wanted." She looked at him. "We have a homestead. We have a homestead near Harrow's Crossing. And there is a valley in the northern range that is unoccupied, that Heron's Valley deed has been sitting unclaimed in the warden's land registry for 11 years, and that I happen to know is accessible to anyone who files a formal claim." He had been to the magistrate's office. He had looked it up. He had not said anything because he was not sure how she would feel about it. If you wanted to file a claim, to have it properly on paper in a way no one could take from you. Her eyes were very bright. "You looked up the registry. I was curious about the deed situation. When did you—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. The look on her face was the cup that was trying not to spill. "You looked up the deed to my mother's summer ground." "I was curious," he said again, quietly. She was on him in the next moment, her arms around his neck and her face pressed against his cheek, holding him with the full strength of her, which was considerable, and he held her back just as hard. They stood in the middle of the valley with the gold September grass and the creek running bright and the sky enormous and blue above the ridge arms, and she held on to him, and he held on to her. "We will file the claim," she said into his shoulder. "We will file the claim," he agreed. They camped 2 nights in the valley, sleeping in the open with a fire ring rebuilt, and the horses picketed on the creek grass and the autumn stars blazing above the ridge line in a way that could not be achieved anywhere near a town. On the second night, with the fire burning down to coals and the blankets laid out and the mountains quiet around them, Murak lay with her head on his chest listening to his heartbeat and the distant creak and the occasional soft sound of the horses. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly. "Tell me," he said. "On the day in the square when you crouched down in front of me," she paused. "I was so certain it was a trap, that there would be a price that was worse than the chain." Her voice was steady, but just barely. "I had been taught so many times by the world that kindness from humans to orcs was always a door with something terrible behind it." "I know," he said. "And you were," she stopped. "You were just kind, with no price. She pressed her face against his chest for a moment. "You just told me I did not have to kneel." He had one arm around her and the other came up to rest on her hair, pressing gently. "You should never have been on your knees in the first place." She was quiet for a while. The coals glowed, the stars moved. "I know that now," she said finally. "I think I have known it for a long time, but you were the first person to say it." He pressed his lips to the top of her head and held her close, and the fire went down, and the night was cold and enormous and completely safe. What happened in the warmth of those blankets under the autumn stars of Heron's Valley, with the horses breathing softly nearby, and the fire, a low gold glow, and the valley holding them in the cupped hands of its ridges, was not something that needed detailed accounting. It was the culmination of a year of trust built brick by brick, of kindness returned with kindness, of 2 people who had looked at each other truly and chosen. There was tenderness in it and warmth, and a kind of joy that was different from happiness because it went deeper, the joy of being known and wanted, of being safe. She was strong and beautiful, and she held him like someone who had feared to need and was now, for the first time, allowing herself to. He was careful and present, and his whole heart was in every moment of it. It was exactly what it should have been, and it settled between them afterward like a new country they had arrived in, one they had been traveling toward all year without quite knowing it. In the morning they made coffee over the rebuilt fire, and watched the sun come over the eastern ridge and fill the valley with light, and she leaned against him on the log they were using as a bench, and he had his arm around her, and there was nothing in the world to want that they did not already have. They rode home at the end of the week, through the passes and down the pine ridge and along the birch trail to the homestead, and the boy watching the stock had done a fine job, and the cows were fat, and the chickens were healthy, and the preserves in the root cellar were exactly as Murak had stacked them, which she checked with proprietary satisfaction. October passed in the particular beauty of the northern borderland autumn, which was the best month of the year if you had enough firewood and enough food and someone to share it with, all of which they had. Eli began drawing plans for a second structure on the homestead property. Not the valley, not yet, but a small separate room off the main house that would serve as a proper study and workspace, because Murak had begun doing something in the evenings that he hadn't initially recognized, and then had recognized with a sharp feeling of something like reverence. She was writing, not letters, not accounts, a record. An oral history of the Darkwolf clan, set down in writing with her steady, precise hand, with the small desk he had built her in the winter installed beneath the east window. She wrote the things her mother had told her, the stories that had no other record, the names and the battles and the summer grounds and the planting songs and the things that would be gone if she did not write them. She wrote in both the common tongue and in Orcish script, in parallel columns, so that both languages could read what had been. He read a page she had left out one afternoon when she was in the barn, and he came in from the field. He read it carefully, the Common Tongue column, a passage about the Darkwolf clan's founding matriarch, a woman named Murak Darkwolf who had led her people across the Great Range 200 years before. He put the page down carefully and felt the weight of what she was doing, the specific and enormous importance of it. When she came in from the barn, he said, "What you're writing is important." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "I know. Has anyone ever," he gestured at the pages. "Has anyone put this down before?" "No," she said. "Orcish clans keep oral record, but oral record requires people alive to hold it." She sat down at the desk and looked at the pages. "I am the only Darkwolf left in the borderland territory who knows all of it. Kara knows some, but she did not listen as carefully as I did." A small, wry pause. "My mother would say I was always too serious." "Your mother was right that you were serious," he said. "She was wrong that it was a problem." She looked at him over her shoulder. The look was warm and full. She reached out and he came and took her hand and she held it for a moment. "The room off the main house," she said, "when you build it. Could it have a north-facing window for even light?" "For a proper writing room," he said. "Yes. I'll put in 2 windows," he said. She squeezed his hand once. Then she went back to writing, and he went back to the plans, and the autumn light went long and golden through the east window over her shoulder. November brought the second year's winter preparations, which went considerably faster and more efficiently than the first year's, because they had done it together once and had learned each other's rhythms completely. The woodpile went up in 4 days. The root cellar was organized with military precision that Murak had developed and Eli had cheerfully adopted. The barn got an entirely new north wall, properly chinked, that would stand for 20 years. The new laying hens were producing well and would continue through winter in their snug coop. On a clear, hard, cold day in late November, Eli was driving fence posts along the south pasture extension with a maul, and Murak was running the new fence line with him, and they had been working for 2 hours in comfortable silence when Murak said, quite calmly, "I am with child." The maul came down slightly sideways on the fence post, which was why it was slightly crooked ever after. Eli turned around. She was watching him with clear copper eyes and an expression that was carefully, watchfully neutral, waiting to see what he made of it. He put the maul down on the ground. "How long have you known?" he said. 3 weeks. "You waited 3 weeks to—" "I wanted to be certain," she said. "And I wanted a pause. I wanted to think about it first, on my own, so that when I told you I could tell you clearly, without surprise muddying the water." He crossed the frozen pasture in 7 strides, and he had her in his arms before she could finish processing that he was moving, and she made a startled sound that dissolved almost immediately into the particular warmth he had learned to hear in her when something had reached the part of her that she kept most carefully guarded. "Is that a glad response?" she said into his shoulder. "That is the best response I have," he said, which was manifestly true. She laughed, and it was the full laugh now, the one that lived in her chest and had been getting freer all year, the one he suspected her mother had had and she had carried forward without knowing it. They stood in the frozen November pasture for a long time, holding each other, while the fence posts waited patiently, and Cork and Barrel watched them from the paddock with the serene philosophical indifference of draft horses who have seen humans behave oddly before and expect they will see it again. The writing room got built in December, before the deep cold settled. 2 north-facing windows, as promised, with oilcloth shutters until spring when Eli planned to commission proper glass from the glazier in Harrow's Crossing. A proper desk, larger than the first, with a bookshelf along the east wall that he built from the best timber he had on the property, fitted and sanded smooth. He did not ask for help. He built it as a gift, and she walked into it for the first time on the day he called her in with her eyes closed and let her open them to the finished room. She stood in the center of it, turning slowly. She touched the bookshelf, running her fingers along the smooth grain. She stood at the north window and looked out at the birch stand along the creek, the winter-bare branches against the gray sky. She sat at the desk, testing the height of it, putting her hands flat on the surface the way she had put her hands flat on the grinding stone in Heron's Valley. She looked at him, standing in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words she had said over the spiced tart on midwinter, the same weight in them. "You're welcome," he said. She patted the chair beside the desk, and he came in and sat in it. And she got out her pages and went back to writing the Darkwolf record while he read the almanac in the warm, lamplit room. And outside, the first snow of the second winter fell quietly on the homestead. The child was born in late June, in the warmth of the early summer, with Hesse in attendance because Hesse had birthed 24 children across the borderland community in her sideline capacity as midwife, and had the manner for it calm, competent, and so matter-of-fact about the entire business that it stripped most of the terror out of it. The child was a boy. He came into the world with his mother's copper eyes and his father's dark hair and the faintest sage-green tint to his skin, not as deep as Murak's, a blend of both, a new thing that had not existed before. He was absolutely enormous for a newborn, which Hesse said with great professional satisfaction was the most vigorous and healthy thing you could hope for. Eli sat on the edge of the bed with Murak, both of them looking at the child between them, and the feeling was beyond anything in his experience, something that had no language for it yet and might not need one. "He needs a name," Murak said. She was exhausted and luminous, the way women are in the hours after birth. "What would you call him in Darkwolf custom?" "In Darkwolf custom," she said, "the first child carries one name from each side, a clan name and a hearthfire name." She looked at the boy. "His clan name is Grash Darkwolf, after the horse I loved and after our clan." A pause. "His hearthfire name is yours to give." Eli looked at the boy. He thought of his father who had built this homestead and left it to him. He thought of the fence line and the birch stand and the creek and the woodpile and the grinding stone in the valley. He thought of the chain and the well and the oat porridge and the honey spoon and the planting song. "Rowan," he said, "for the rowan tree at the east field edge." He paused. "It was the first thing I noticed when I came to this land. It bloomed in April even in the hard years." She looked at the boy. "Rowan Grashed Weston Darkwolf. That is a name that will need a very large desk to sign," he said. She smiled, slowly, fully, the smile that he had first seen in the barn over Cork's Main and had been in love with ever since. "He will grow into it." She reached out without looking at him, just reached sideways and found his hand, and he held hers. They sat together with Rowan Grashed between them, while the June afternoon turned the windows gold, and the creek ran its commentary, and somewhere in the birch stand a crow called, and the rowan tree at the east field edge stood in full leaf against the summer sky. Life at the homestead in the years that followed had the quality of something growing, not explosively, not all at once, but steadily, the way good things grow in honest ground. Rowan grew into a child who walked at 10 months with the serious determination of someone who has places to be, and who spoke his first word at 14 months, which was the Orcish word for horse, and his second word at 16 months, which was the common tongue word for bread, both of which were, Eli said, extremely accurate representations of his priorities. Kara and Davin returned permanently to the borderland when Rowan was 2 years old, having spent 3 years moving between the Eastern Pass and the Deep Range, and decided that they were done moving. They built a homestead 7 miles north of Eli's, at the mouth of the northern trail toward Heron's Valley, which positioned them perfectly for the summer ground arrangement. Kara was with child herself by then, and gave birth to a daughter in the spring whom she named Gruck, for the founding matriarch, which Murak said was entirely correct, and Eli said was a name with a great deal of character to it. The claim on Heron's Valley went through the warden's land registry in the spring of the second year, signed in both Murak's hand and Eli's as joint holders, and was confirmed by Judge Caro with her characteristic lack of ceremony and complete legal competence. Murak held the deed for a long time after it was handed to her, feeling the paper between her fingers, reading the words that confirmed that the summer ground of the Darkwolf clan was, in legal record, Darkwolf land again. She filed it in the writing room, in the cedar box she kept for the most important documents, beside the pages of the clan record. The clan record grew year by year, the columns in both languages filling from the top of the shelf downward, the history of a people being set down for every person who came after to find. Harrow's Crossing changed, as towns do when enough individual people in them change. The farrier's apprentice grew up and became a farrier himself, and treated Murak's horses with the same professional dedication he gave every other customer, and had done since he was 16, and she had answered his questions about Orcish ironwork with patient expertise. Hessa ran for the town council and won, and brought with her a particular no-nonsense perspective on common-sense ordinances that was extremely effective. Corporal Daves was transferred to a distant garrison posting that was widely understood to be a consequence of a formal complaint about his conduct, filed with the warden by one Eli Weston in the spring after the Market Square incident, a complaint that had taken a year to work through the official system, but had worked through it regardless. Burrell of the Landowners' Council retired and his son took over the land operation, and the son was a different kind of man, not precisely an advocate for change, but not interested in the old fights either, which in practical terms accomplished much the same thing. The world did not become uncomplicated or perfectly just. It was still a borderland, still a hard world with a difficult history and a long way left to travel. People still looked at Murak and Eli and Harrow's Crossing sometimes in ways that were less than kind. The garrison still had officers who believed what they believed. The Deep Range still had clan war chiefs who distrusted any orc who had made a life among humans. The world was the world. But on a spring afternoon when Rowan was 4 years old and Murak was in the writing room with the north windows open, and the smell of the thaw coming in off the birch stand, and Eli was planting the south field, and Rowan was toddling behind him in the furrows pulling out interesting rocks, and the creek was running loud and clear from the snowmelt, and the rowan tree at the east field edge was blooming white on that spring afternoon. The world as it existed in the boundaries of this particular homestead was good. It was genuinely, demonstrably, fully good. Murak came to the north window and looked out across the field at Eli and Rowan, Eli planting with steady efficiency, and the child behind him completely invested in the geology of the south field. She watched them for a long time, her hands on the window frame, the spring light warm on her face and the smell of green things and turned earth coming in on the wind. She thought about the Market Square in the autumn, 3.5 years ago. She thought about the chain and the collar and the dirt and the crowd, and the man who had crouched down in front of her in that crowd and told her she did not have to kneel. She had looked for the trick that day and found none, and she had wept into her hands with the release of something she had held locked down for so long she had forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. She had held it for so long. The bracing, the constant readiness for the blow, the decision in every human interaction to reveal nothing, offer nothing, give no one leverage, the particular loneliness of a life spent armored. She thought about Eli asleep in the chair by the fire, snoring, while she was reading across the room. She thought about his face when she told him she was with child, the 7 strides across the frozen pasture. She thought about the deed to Heron's Valley in the cedar box, and the writing room with 2 north windows, and the day he had crouched in the dirt of the square and looked at her without flinching. She thought about the morning coffee and the spiced tart and the planting song and the night under the stars in the valley. She thought about what her mother had said, about kindness from humans always being a door with something terrible behind it. Her mother had been right about most things. She had not lived long enough to know that she was wrong about this one. Eli looked up from the south field and saw her in the window, and he raised one hand. Rowan, alerted by his father's motion, looked at the window too and raised both hands with the enthusiasm of a child for whom waving is the best possible activity. She raised her hand back, to both of them. Then she went back to the writing room and sat at her desk and picked up her pen and wrote. The summer ground of the Darkwolf clan is bounded to the north by the Long Ridge, to the east by the High Pine, to the south by the Great Creek, and to the west by the red stone face of the Upper Pass. For 3 generations, my mothers brought their children here in June when the wild thyme was blooming. This ground is theirs by memory and law alike. Let no one say otherwise. She wrote for another hour while the afternoon light moved slowly across the room. And when Eli came in from the field with Rowan on his shoulders and a large and interesting rock in Rowan's hand that required immediate presentation to his mother, she put down the pen and came out of the writing room and took the rock seriously and examined it with appropriate gravity. And Eli looked at her over their son's head with that look. The one he had been looking at her with since the porridge and the honey and the February morning by the fire, the look that had everything in it and no trick behind it at all. She loved him with her whole life, and she always had, and she always would. The homestead stood for decades. The birch stand grew. The rowan tree bloomed every spring without fail. The writing room filled with pages, the Darkwolf record growing shelf by shelf into something that scholars and historians would eventually come to Harrow's Crossing to read, a journey that surprised no one who had known Murak Darkwolf and exactly nothing about her. Kara's daughter Gruck grew up with Rowan and his younger brother Hal, who arrived 2 years after Rowan with his mother's full copper eyes and his grandmother's name for a middle name. And the 3 children ranged across the homestead and the northern trail and the edges of Heron's Valley, with the freedom of children who have never been taught to be afraid of the world. Eli Weston and Murak Darkwolf grew old together in the way people grow old when they have done it right, not without loss or difficulty, because no life is without those, but with a fullness that made the losses bearable and a closeness that deepened instead of diminishing, year by year. They sat on the porch step on the summer evenings the way they had started sitting on it years ago, his arm around her shoulders, watching the fireflies over the creek and the stars coming up above the ridge. And the silence between them had the quality it always had, the particular silence of 2 people who know each other so completely that they have no need to fill it, and choose to sit inside it instead, because the silence itself is a kind of conversation. A constant, low, ongoing statement of the only thing that matters. You are here, I am here, this is real, we chose this. They had chosen it freely, both of them. From the morning she had said yes over the porridge bowl to the evening decades later when they sat on the step watching their grandchildren, Kara's grandchildren too, mix and sort and play in the yard with the equanimity of a generation for whom the old categories made considerably less sense. The world was still the world, but the corner of it that was theirs was stubbornly, persistently, fully good. Once, on an evening when they were well along in years but not yet old, Murak was sitting at the desk in the writing room as Eli came to stand in the doorway, as he had done so many times, and she looked up at him in the lamplight with her copper eyes that age had not dimmed and her black hair threaded with the first silver and her face that was more familiar to him than his own reflection. "What are you writing?" he said. "The Day in the Square," she said. "I have been putting it off." He came in and sat in the chair beside the desk, the one he had sat in on the winter evening when she had written and he had read the almanac. "How do you write about the chain?" he said. "Write what happened," she said, "and then I write what happened next." He looked at the page. She had already written a paragraph. He read it carefully, the way he read everything she wrote, which was to say with total attention and no skipping. The last line of the paragraph read, "He told me I did not have to kneel, and for the first time in my life I believed that it was true." He looked at her. She was watching him read as she always did. He reached out and covered her hand with his on the desk. Outside, the creek ran along the eastern fence line, the same creek it had always been, and the rowan tree stood at the edge of the east field in the last of the autumn light, its leaves going gold and its berries red, and the homestead was warm and lit, and full of the sound of the life they had built, and everything was exactly as it should be.